Sometimes life has to break your plans before it can introduce you to the place where you truly belong. I had always believed that every mile mattered. Every delivery completed on time meant another promise kept, another customer satisfied, another step toward building the small trucking company my father had dreamed of before he was gone. For 7 straight years, I chased highways instead of sunsets, fuel receipts instead of weekends, and deadlines instead of memories. My truck had become my office, my kitchen, my living room, and sometimes even my bedroom. I convinced myself that this was what responsible adults did. You kept moving. You kept working. You never slowed down long enough to wonder whether the road you were following was still the one you wanted. The Cascade Mountains had always been one of my favorite routes, especially during early autumn when the forests turned shades of gold and crimson. That morning had started like every other trip. The cargo was secure. The weather forecast mentioned scattered showers, but nothing unusual. I had a delivery scheduled outside Portland before noon the following day, and according to my navigation system, everything was perfectly on schedule. Then the clouds arrived. They rolled over the mountains faster than I had ever seen before, swallowing the sunlight until the entire highway looked as though evening had arrived hours too early. Rain struck the windshield in heavy waves, forcing the wipers to work as fast as they could. Wind pushed against the truck hard enough to make me grip the steering wheel with both hands. Lightning flashed somewhere beyond the endless rows of towering pine trees, followed by thunder that echoed through the valley. I eased off the accelerator and focused on the narrow road ahead. I had driven through storms before. I respected them, but I never feared them. That confidence lasted exactly 30 seconds. The engine coughed once. Then again. Every warning light across the dashboard suddenly glowed at once. My heart sank before I even reached for the ignition. The truck lost power and slowly rolled onto the shoulder before coming to a complete stop beside the empty mountain road. Rain continued hammering the roof while the engine answered every attempt to restart it with nothing more than a dry clicking sound. I leaned back in my seat and let out a slow breath. My phone showed exactly what I expected to see. No service. I stepped outside anyway, pulling the hood of my bright blue denim jacket over my head. Cold rain soaked through my clothes almost instantly. Steam drifted from beneath the open hood, but I knew enough about engines to recognize when guessing would only make things worse. I looked in both directions. There were no passing cars, no nearby houses, no gas station, nothing except miles of forest disappearing into the storm. Then another flash of lightning briefly revealed something beyond the next curve in the road. A small amber light shimmered through the rain before disappearing again. I narrowed my eyes. Another flash. This time I saw it clearly. A weathered wooden cabin stood alone in a clearing, warm light glowing through its windows like a lighthouse in the middle of a dark sea. It was the only sign of life anywhere around me. I locked my truck, slipped my wallet into my pocket, and started walking toward that distant glow. The gravel path climbed gently uphill beneath dripping pine branches until I reached a wide wooden porch. Smoke curled from the chimney. Flower boxes rested beneath the windows despite the storm, and neatly stacked firewood lined one wall. Someone had built more than a cabin here. They had built a home. I raised my hand and knocked 3 times. For a moment, nothing happened except the steady sound of rain. Then slow footsteps approached from inside. The door opened halfway. Standing there was a man about my age with ash-brown hair, calm gray eyes, and a forest green flannel shirt rolled neatly to his forearms. He studied me quietly, not with suspicion, but with the strange expression of someone who had been expecting the moment long before it arrived. I offered an awkward smile despite the rain dripping from my face. "I am sorry to bother you," I said. "My truck broke down about a mile away." His eyes shifted briefly toward the storm before returning to mine. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. As he stepped aside and said, "I know." I heard the engine fall silent, and I had a feeling someone would eventually find this door. The warm air inside the cabin wrapped around me almost instantly, carrying the comforting scent of cedar wood, fresh bread, and coffee that had only recently been brewed. After hours of cold rain and growing frustration, the simple warmth felt almost unreal. I slipped off my soaked denim jacket and placed my muddy boots beside the front door after the stranger pointed toward a woven rug. "Thank you," I said quietly. I was beginning to think I would spend the night inside my truck. He closed the door behind me and locked it before answering. Not many people drive this road during storms. You were lucky the engine stopped where it did. His voice remained calm, steady, almost as peaceful as the fire burning inside the stone fireplace across the room. I am Ethan, I said while accepting the thick towel he offered. Mason, he replied with a small nod. No last name. No unnecessary explanation. Somehow that seemed perfectly natural. While I dried my hair, I glanced around the cabin. Everything looked carefully built instead of simply purchased. Handcrafted shelves lined one wall, filled with journals, field guides, and weathered cameras. Large windows overlooked the forest, where rain continued falling across towering pines. Beside the fireplace, an elderly golden retriever slowly lifted his head, studied me with calm brown eyes, and after deciding I was not a threat, rested his chin back on his paws. That is Maple, Mason said. He usually takes longer before trusting strangers. I smiled as Maple lazily wagged his tail once. I will consider that a compliment. Mason disappeared into the kitchen before returning with 2 steaming bowls of vegetable stew and thick slices of homemade bread. I hope you are hungry, he said. Very, I admitted honestly. Truck stop sandwiches lose their charm after the 3rd day. A faint smile crossed his face before disappearing again. We sat across from each other at a small wooden table while the storm continued tapping gently against the windows. The silence between us never felt uncomfortable. Instead, it carried the same quiet rhythm as the fire crackling nearby. It was the kind of silence that invited people to breathe more slowly. After several minutes, I looked toward the rain outside. Do you think the weather clears tomorrow? Mason followed my gaze before answering. The rain might. The bridge south of here probably will not. It floods every time storms like this move through the valley. I paused with my spoon halfway to my mouth. So even if my truck starts tomorrow, I still cannot leave? Mason nodded. The county crews usually need at least a full day to inspect it before reopening traffic. I leaned back with a quiet laugh that sounded more surprised than disappointed. I guess the mountains just canceled my schedule. Mason wrapped both hands around his coffee mug before speaking again. Sometimes schedules are easier to replace than peace of mind. I looked at him, wondering what kind of experiences had taught him to say something like that so naturally. Before I could ask, Maple slowly walked across the room and rested his head gently against my knee. I scratched behind his ears while his tail tapped softly against the wooden floor. Mason watched the old dog with genuine surprise. That is unusual, he admitted. He normally keeps his distance from visitors. Maybe he feels sorry for stranded truck drivers, I joked. Mason shook his head with another faint smile. No, Maple only does that when he believes someone belongs here, even if it is only for a little while. The sentence lingered in the warm cabin long after he finished speaking. Outside, the storm continued covering the mountains in darkness, but inside that small cabin, with fresh bread still warm on the table and a loyal old dog quietly leaning against my leg, I realized something unexpected. For the first time in years, there was nowhere else I needed to be. Morning arrived so quietly that for a moment I forgot where I was. Instead of traffic outside my window, I woke to birds singing somewhere beyond the trees and the gentle crackling of firewood still glowing inside the stone fireplace. Soft golden sunlight slipped through the cabin windows, filling every corner with a warmth that felt completely different from the fluorescent lights of truck stops and loading docks. For the first time in years, I reached for my phone without immediately checking delivery schedules. There was still no signal. Surprisingly, that no longer felt like bad news. I stepped into the kitchen where Mason was already preparing breakfast with calm, practiced movements. Fresh bread rested on a wooden cutting board, while coffee slowly dripped into 2 ceramic mugs. Maple greeted me with an enthusiastic wag of his tail before returning to his favorite spot beside the stove. Good morning, Mason said. I hope you slept well. I smiled as I accepted the mug he handed me. Better than I have in months. He nodded as though he had expected that answer. We ate breakfast while watching thin ribbons of morning mist drift between the towering pine trees outside the window. There was no television playing in the background, no ringing phone, no rush to finish eating. Every minute felt slower, yet somehow more complete. After breakfast, Mason suggested we check on my truck before deciding what to do next. We followed the narrow trail back toward the roadside, Maple trotting happily several steps ahead as though leading an important expedition. The rain had finally stopped, leaving thousands of tiny droplets sparkling on every branch. My truck looked exactly as I had left it, except now it stood beneath a bright blue sky instead of a storm. Mason lifted the hood and spent several quiet minutes examining the engine. "The fuel line is damaged," he finally said. "I think I can repair it, but I will need a replacement part from the hardware store in town." "How far is town?" I asked. "About 20 miles. The bridge is still closed, so nobody can drive there today." I sighed before laughing softly. The universe really wants me to stay here. Mason closed the hood and looked toward the mountains. Sometimes circumstances make decisions for us. On the walk back, Maple suddenly disappeared into the trees before returning proudly with a long fallen branch almost twice his size. He dropped it directly in front of us, clearly expecting applause. I picked it up and threw it a short distance across the clearing. Maple charged after it with surprising energy for an older dog, making both of us laugh. "He acts like he is still a puppy," I said. Mason smiled warmly. "He reminds me every day that growing older does not mean you stop enjoying simple things." Back at the cabin, Mason disappeared into a small workshop behind the house while I wandered through the garden. Wooden planters overflowed with herbs, tomatoes, and late-season flowers. Wind chimes moved gently above the porch, blending with birdsong and the distant sound of water flowing somewhere beyond the trees. Everything around me reflected patience rather than perfection. A few minutes later, Mason returned carrying a weathered camera. "Would you like to take a walk?" he asked. "There is a small lake nearby. The wildlife usually comes out after storms." We followed a narrow forest path beneath tall evergreens until the trees suddenly opened onto a peaceful mountain lake that reflected the bright morning sky like polished glass. Mason quietly raised his camera toward a pair of deer drinking near the shoreline. Without thinking, I stepped closer so I could see through the viewfinder. Our shoulders almost touched as we stood there in complete silence, sharing the same breathtaking view. Neither of us spoke because neither of us needed to. Somewhere between the quiet forest, the still water, and the gentle click of Mason's camera shutter, I realized the mountains were giving me something I had not known I had lost: the ability to simply be present. The walk back from the lake felt different, although neither of us said anything that could explain why. The narrow trail wound through tall pines, their branches swaying gently in the afternoon breeze, while Maple happily wandered ahead, occasionally stopping to make sure we were still following him. Mason carried his camera over one shoulder, carefully reviewing the photographs he had taken by the water. "Would you like to see them?" he asked, holding the camera toward me. I stepped closer until our shoulders almost touched again. The first few photographs showed deer standing quietly near the shoreline, a family of ducks gliding across the still water, and sunlight reflecting through drifting mist. Then another picture appeared on the screen. It was me, standing beside the lake with my hands tucked into my jacket pockets, completely unaware that he had pressed the shutter. I laughed softly. "I did not even notice you took that." Mason looked almost embarrassed. "You looked peaceful." There was a brief pause before he added, "It seemed worth remembering." We continued walking until the cabin came into view, surrounded by late afternoon sunlight that painted the weathered wood in warm shades of gold. After leaving the camera safely inside, Mason led me toward a small workshop behind the cabin. Shelves lined every wall, filled with hand tools, carved wooden bowls, unfinished picture frames, and carefully labeled jars of screws and nails. "You made all of this?" I asked. He nodded. "Mostly during winter. Snow keeps people inside for months around here." My attention drifted toward a framed photograph resting on a nearby shelf. It showed a younger Mason standing inside a large photography gallery, smiling beside several enormous wildlife prints. "That looks important," I said. His expression softened as he picked up the frame. It was my first exhibition in Seattle. I studied the image again. "What happened?" Mason smiled gently, but there was unmistakable sadness behind it. "Success happened too quickly. Every assignment became another deadline. Every photograph became another product. One day I realized I had stopped looking at nature and had started looking only at contracts." He carefully returned the frame to its place. "So I came back here." His answer lingered with me long after we stepped outside again. As evening settled over the mountains, we sat together on the front porch with fresh coffee while Maple rested comfortably across our feet. The forest slowly filled with the sounds of crickets and distant owls. It was the kind of peaceful evening that seemed impossible to rush. After a long silence, Mason looked toward the fading sunlight. "What about you?" he asked quietly. "Why keep driving so much?" I stared into my coffee before answering. My father always wanted to build a trucking company that people trusted. After he passed away, I told myself I would finish what he started. Somewhere along the way, I forgot the difference between honoring a dream and becoming trapped inside it. Mason listened without interrupting. That simple kindness made it easier to continue. Every time I thought about slowing down, I felt guilty, like I was letting someone down. Mason nodded slowly. Sometimes the people we miss would probably ask us to be happier instead of busier. I looked toward him, surprised by how accurately those words reached something I had never spoken aloud. Neither of us tried to solve the other's past. We simply allowed those stories to exist between us, carried gently by the cool evening air. Before going inside, Mason glanced toward the mountains now glowing beneath countless stars. "The county usually gives another bridge update tomorrow," he said quietly. "You might be able to leave sooner than expected." I looked at the peaceful cabin, the warm light spilling through its windows, and the old golden retriever sleeping without a worry in the world. Just 2 days earlier, hearing that news would have filled me with relief. Instead, I found myself wishing tomorrow would take just a little longer to arrive. The next morning unfolded with the kind of gentle stillness that made clocks feel unnecessary. Warm sunlight spilled across the cabin floor while the smell of fresh bread drifted through the kitchen. I found Mason standing at the counter, carefully rolling dough with the quiet concentration he seemed to bring into everything he did. Maple sat beside him with complete confidence that breakfast always involved generous samples. The old dog looked from Mason to the bread, then back again, as though silently negotiating a better deal. I laughed before either of us said a word. Mason glanced over his shoulder with an amused smile. He believes persistence is a professional skill. Maple placed one paw against Mason's leg at exactly the right moment, earning himself a tiny piece of dough and proving his point. "I think he just won the argument," I said. Mason nodded. "He usually does." After breakfast he packed sandwiches, fresh apples, and a thermos of coffee into a worn canvas bag. "There is a place I would like to show you," he said. We followed a narrow trail leading beyond the lake until the forest opened onto a quiet hillside covered with tall grass moving gently in the morning breeze. Below us the valley stretched for miles, painted in shades of green, gold, and deep evergreen beneath a cloudless sky. It was beautiful in the kind of effortless way that photographs could never fully capture. We spread an old blanket across the grass while Maple wandered nearby, happily chasing butterflies that always escaped him. "Do you come here often?" I asked. Mason nodded. "Whenever life starts feeling too loud." I looked around in surprise. It is hard to imagine anything feeling loud out here. He smiled thoughtfully. "The noise is usually inside your head." We sat together drinking coffee while a hawk circled high above the valley. There was no need to fill every silence with conversation. Somehow the quiet between us had become its own language. After a while I picked up a smooth stone and tossed it lightly down the hillside. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had stayed in Seattle?" Mason watched the stone disappear into the grass before answering. "Sometimes. Then I remember I would never have met the people I met here." His answer lingered with me. "Including stranded truck drivers?" I asked with a grin. He laughed softly. "Especially them." Maple suddenly returned carrying a ridiculously oversized stick, dropping it across both our legs as though presenting an important gift. We both burst into laughter trying to move the heavy branch aside. For several minutes we forgot entirely about bridges, broken engines, and unfinished deliveries. Later that afternoon we wandered back toward the cabin, stopping beside the lake where the water reflected the bright autumn sky without a single ripple. Mason skipped a flat stone across the surface 6 times before it finally disappeared. I tried the same thing and watched mine sink immediately with one disappointing splash. "I think the lake rejected me," I joked. "It is only encouraging you to keep practicing," Mason replied. "That sounds suspiciously optimistic." Optimism makes life easier. As the sun slowly lowered behind the mountains, we returned to the cabin porch where Maple curled up at our feet. The peaceful evening was interrupted only when an old county maintenance truck rolled slowly into the driveway. The driver stepped out with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm and greeted Mason with a friendly wave. Good news, he called. The inspection crews finished earlier than expected. If everything checks out overnight, the bridge should reopen tomorrow morning. He climbed back into the truck and drove away before either of us answered. The sound of the engine faded into the distance, leaving only the wind moving through the pine trees. I looked toward the road disappearing beyond the forest, then back at the warm cabin glowing beneath the evening light. Just yesterday, I had been counting the hours until I could leave. Now, for reasons I could not fully explain, tomorrow suddenly felt like it had arrived far too soon. The next morning arrived beneath a sky so clear it almost seemed unfair. After days of storms and drifting clouds, the mountains stretched endlessly beneath bright autumn sunlight, and every pine tree stood sharply outlined against the blue horizon. I woke before sunrise, not because of an alarm, but because I could hear Mason quietly splitting firewood outside. By the time I stepped onto the porch with my blue mug of coffee, he had already stacked another neat row beside the cabin. Maple wandered between us, carrying the same worn tennis ball he insisted was still the greatest treasure in the forest. "Good morning," I called. Mason looked up and smiled. "You are awake earlier than usual." I shrugged. I did not want to waste the morning. He leaned the axe against the woodpile. "That sounds like something a man says after spending too much time in the mountains." We both laughed, and for a moment neither of us mentioned what today was supposed to bring. After breakfast, we walked together toward my truck with a small toolbox swinging gently from Mason's hand. The mountain air carried the crisp scent of pine needles and damp earth, while Maple happily ran ahead, stopping every few yards to make sure we were still following. Mason opened the hood and studied the engine with the same patient focus I had come to admire over the past few days. "The replacement fuel line should hold," he said. "I also tightened the loose belt yesterday while you were gathering firewood." I handed him the flashlight before he even asked for it. He looked at me with quiet amusement. "You are learning my routine." "I had a good teacher," I replied. Nearly an hour later, he stepped back from the engine and nodded toward the driver's seat. "Go ahead." I climbed inside, took a slow breath, and turned the key. The engine came to life immediately, settling into a smooth, steady rumble that echoed softly through the valley. A few days ago, that sound would have felt like victory. Now it felt strangely bittersweet. I climbed back down, and Mason closed the hood with a satisfied pat. "She is ready for many more miles," he said. "Thank you," I answered sincerely. "You probably saved my schedule, my business, and my wallet." "I only fixed a truck," he replied. "The rest is still yours to figure out." As I reached to gather my jacket from the fender, I accidentally brushed against the engine and left a dark streak of grease across my cheek. Mason noticed immediately. His lips curved into the warmest smile I had seen since arriving. "Hold still." He reached into his pocket and unfolded a neatly pressed handkerchief. For a brief second he hesitated, then gently handed it to me instead of wiping the grease away himself. Our fingers brushed as I accepted it, and the simple contact somehow carried more meaning than either of us could explain. I laughed when I finally caught my reflection in the truck window. I looked like I lost a fight with my own engine. Mason folded his arms. The engine clearly fought back. Even Maple barked once, as though agreeing with him. We spent the rest of the afternoon on the porch, sharing coffee while the old dog slept with his head resting across both our boots, connecting us without realizing it. We talked about favorite books, terrible cooking experiments, forgotten childhood dreams, and places we still hope to visit one day. Conversation flowed so naturally that time slipped past unnoticed. Just before sunset, Mason looked toward the winding mountain road and quietly said, "If the county keeps its promise, the bridge will reopen first thing tomorrow morning." I followed his gaze, watching the empty road disappear into the trees. Only a few days earlier, I had been counting every minute until I could drive away. Now I found myself wishing that one more evening could somehow last forever, because I was beginning to understand that the hardest part of any journey was not finding the road home. Sometimes it was leaving the place that had quietly started to feel like home in the first place. Morning arrived with a silence so complete that I could hear the distant river long before I opened my eyes. Pale sunlight filtered through the cabin windows, painting soft golden lines across the wooden floor, while the familiar smell of fresh coffee drifted from the kitchen. Everything looked exactly the same as the day before, yet every ordinary detail seemed heavier, because we both knew this morning carried an ending neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Mason had already prepared breakfast when I walked in. Fresh biscuits, scrambled eggs, homemade blackberry jam, and the same blue ceramic mug waiting in the place where I always sat. He glanced up with an easy smile that almost convinced me nothing had changed. "Good morning," he said. "Coffee is still hot." I took the mug and smiled back. "You remembered." He shrugged lightly. "Some routines are worth keeping." Maple wandered between us, carrying his old tennis ball before dropping it beside my chair with complete confidence that breakfast should include at least one game of fetch. I laughed, tossed the ball gently across the room, and watched him hurry after it with joyful determination. The simple moment filled the cabin with laughter that faded just a little too quickly. Neither of us mentioned the bridge. Neither of us mentioned the truck. We stretched breakfast longer than necessary, talking about harmless things instead. Mason recommended a mystery novel I had never read. I insisted Truck Stop Coffee deserved a better reputation than people gave it. He disagreed immediately, and for several minutes we debated coffee with exaggerated seriousness until both of us were laughing again. Eventually, there were no more dishes to wash and no more excuses left. Together, we carried my backpack toward the truck. The engine started immediately, running smoothly beneath the bright autumn sky. Mason listened for a few seconds before closing the hood with quiet satisfaction. "Everything sounds good," he said. "You should reach the interstate without any trouble." I nodded slowly. "I still owe you more than I can repay." He shook his head. "You do not owe me anything." I reached into my wallet and handed him one of my business cards. "If you ever need supplies delivered out here, or if you ever decide to travel again, call me." Mason accepted the card carefully instead of slipping it casually into his pocket. He looked at it for a brief moment before placing it inside the notebook he carried everywhere. Then he disappeared into the cabin and returned holding a small parcel wrapped neatly in brown paper and tied with simple twine. "Do not open it until you stop for lunch," he said. I turned the package over curiously. "Now I want to open it immediately." His smile became just a little brighter. "Please wait." "All right," I promised. Maple walked over and leaned gently against my leg while I scratched behind his ears. He looked up at me with calm brown eyes that somehow understood more than words ever could. "Take good care of him," I said quietly. Mason looked down at the old dog before answering. "He usually waits by the porch after someone leaves." I hesitated. "For how long?" Mason lifted his eyes toward the winding road disappearing between the pines. "As long as he believes they might come back." The sentence settled quietly between us. No dramatic farewell followed. No promises that sounded too perfect to believe. I climbed into the driver's seat and lowered the window one last time. Mason stood only a few feet away, hands tucked into the pockets of his forest green flannel shirt, while Maple rested beside him. "Drive safely, Ethan," he said. "And remember that this door will always open if you ever decide to knock again." I smiled because every sentence I wanted to say suddenly felt too small. I eased the truck onto the narrow mountain road and slowly disappeared between the towering pines. Even after the cabin vanished from sight, I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, realizing that for the first time in years I was not thinking about where the road ahead would take me. I was already wondering how long it would be before I found my way back. The familiar rhythm of highway life welcomed me back exactly where I had left it. Freight terminals buzzed with forklifts before sunrise, fuel stations echoed with diesel engines, and my phone filled once again with delivery confirmations, route adjustments, and customer messages. From the outside, nothing had changed. I was still Ethan Walker, still driving the same truck across the Pacific Northwest, still keeping every promise printed on my schedule. Yet somewhere between those endless miles, I realized the person behind the steering wheel was no longer the same man who had entered the mountains a week earlier. Every morning I reached for coffee and instinctively searched for a heavy blue ceramic mug before remembering it was waiting hundreds of miles away inside a quiet cabin. Every evening I parked beneath bright truck stoplights and found myself missing the sound of wind moving gently through pine trees instead of engines idling beside me. Even the silence felt different now. It no longer seemed empty. It reminded me of something I had left behind. Nearly 3 weeks passed before I finally remembered the small parcel Mason had asked me not to open until lunch. Somehow it had remained tucked safely inside the storage compartment beside my passenger seat. One clear afternoon, I pulled into a quiet picnic area overlooking a slow-moving river, turned off the engine, and carefully untied the simple twine wrapped around the brown paper. Inside rested a beautifully carved wooden compass, smooth beneath my fingertips and clearly shaped by hand instead of machine. Folded neatly beneath it was a single handwritten note. I unfolded it carefully. Mason's familiar handwriting covered only a few lines. Sometimes the shortest road is the one that leads you back to the place where your mind finally became quiet. I turned the compass over and noticed another sentence carved into the polished wood. There will always be fresh coffee waiting if you ever decide to return. I sat there for a long time watching sunlight dance across the river while the engine remained silent beside me. Lunch stayed untouched. Deadlines stopped mattering. Somewhere during those quiet minutes, I admitted something I had been avoiding ever since driving away from the cabin. I did not miss the mountains simply because they were beautiful. I missed the life I had lived there. I missed conversations without clocks. I missed evenings without notifications. I missed someone who listened more carefully than anyone I had ever met. The following Monday, I surprised my dispatcher with a request I never imagined making. I would like fewer long-haul assignments, I said. He laughed, assuming I was joking. When he realized I was serious, he asked whether everything was all right. I smiled while turning the wooden compass slowly between my fingers. Actually, I answered honestly, I think everything is finally becoming all right. 2 Saturdays later, I packed an overnight bag into the truck before sunrise. The compass rested beside the steering wheel instead of my navigation system because I no longer needed directions. Every turn through the Cascade Mountains felt strangely familiar, as though the road itself remembered me. By late afternoon, I reached the narrow gravel driveway leading toward the cabin. Autumn had painted the forest in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and the cool mountain air carried the same comforting scent of cedar and pine. My heart beat faster as I parked beside the porch. The cabin stood quietly beneath the trees, exactly as I remembered, except the front door was closed and no smoke drifted from the chimney. Maple's worn tennis ball still rested beside the porch steps. I knocked once. No answer came. I waited, then knocked again. Silence. Just as disappointment began settling over me, I noticed fresh boot prints crossing the damp ground beside the cabin. They disappeared into the forest trail leading toward the lake. I slipped the compass into my jacket pocket, looked once more at the quiet cabin, and without another moment of hesitation followed the footprints beneath the golden trees, hoping the road I had chosen this time would lead me exactly where my heart had already arrived. The forest trail curved gently around the lake, every familiar step carrying me deeper into a place that already felt more like home than anywhere I had parked my truck before. Golden autumn leaves drifted through the afternoon air while sunlight shimmered across the still water in soft ribbons of amber and silver. I followed the fresh footprints without hurrying, almost afraid that if I reached the end too quickly, whatever had drawn me back here might disappear. Then Maple appeared first. The old golden retriever burst through the trees carrying his faded tennis ball, barking with unmistakable excitement before running straight toward me. I laughed as he leaned against my legs, wagging his tail so enthusiastically that he nearly lost his balance. I missed you too, buddy, I said while scratching behind his ears. The familiar voice that answered from somewhere ahead stopped me where I stood. I had a feeling he would find you before I did. I looked up. Mason stood only a short distance away beside the edge of the lake, his weathered camera hanging loosely against his forest green flannel shirt. Behind him, the calm water reflected the mountains so perfectly that the horizon seemed to disappear into another world. For a brief moment, neither of us moved. We simply smiled, each quietly confirming that the other was real. I finally held up the carved wooden compass. It worked, I said. Mason laughed softly, the same gentle laugh I had replayed in my memory during countless miles on the highway. I hoped it would. We met halfway along the shoreline, close enough that neither of us needed to raise our voices. I thought you might still be on assignment somewhere, he admitted. I tried, I answered honestly. The roads were still there. The deliveries were still there. But every mile kept reminding me that something important was missing. Mason looked toward the quiet lake before asking, "Did you figure out what it was?" I smiled. Not what. Who? The words settled naturally between us, carrying no pressure and asking for nothing more than honesty. Mason lowered his eyes for a moment before speaking again. I kept making coffee for 2 every morning during the first week after you left. I looked at him with quiet surprise. He shrugged with an embarrassed smile. Old habits are difficult to break. I never stopped looking for the blue mug, I admitted. We both laughed, and somehow that simple laughter dissolved every mile that had separated us. Maple wandered ahead toward the old wooden dock, stopping only when he realized neither of us was following quickly enough. Together we walked to the end of the dock, where we had once skipped stones across the water. The boards creaked beneath our feet exactly as I remembered. Mason reached into his backpack and carefully handed me a freshly printed photograph. It showed the empty porch of the cabin at sunrise. 2 steaming coffee mugs rested side by side on the railing, while Maple slept peacefully between them. There were no people in the picture, yet somehow it captured both of us perfectly. I turned the photograph over. On the back, Mason had written only one sentence. Home is the place where someone quietly saves a seat for you, even when they do not know if you are coming back. I read the words twice before slipping the photograph carefully beside the compass inside my jacket. The evening breeze carried the scent of pine and cedar across the lake, while the first stars slowly appeared above the mountains. We remained seated on the dock, shoulders lightly touching, watching the last golden light fade beyond the trees. No dramatic promises were needed. No grand declarations could have improved the quiet certainty growing between us. My truck would still carry me to new places. Mason would still photograph the changing seasons. Life would continue moving forward, just as it always had. The difference was that now every road no longer ended with another destination on a map. Somewhere beyond the mountains stood a weathered cabin with warm lights in the windows, fresh coffee waiting in a blue mug, an old dog eager to greet returning friends, and one quiet man who had reminded me that success meant very little if there was no one to share the journey with. As the stars reflected across the peaceful lake and the mountains settled into evening silence, I realized that the greatest detours in life are often the ones that finally lead us exactly where we were always meant to be.